Solon was one of the greatest and most influential statesmen of ancient Greece. He became famous for reforming Athenian society and establishing a law code for Athens. Solon enacted measures to protect the poorer classes and make Athenian society more equitable. His reforms were an attempt to harmonize Athenian society and to end the civil strife which often plagued the city. Solon was born on the island of Salamis to a noble Athenian family in the 7th century BCE. During Solon's time, Athenian society was deeply stratified between the aristocratic elite and the laboring masses. The Athenian social order was volatile, as class resentment was high and civic unrest persistent. The single greatest challenge Solon faced in addressing these problems was to mitigate the extreme poverty in which many Athenians lived. Most of the population consisted of small-scale farmers who often struggled to feed themselves. During these times, these farmers depended on credit from wealthier citizens. This perpetuated a cycle by which the wealth became increasingly consolidated into fewer hands, while those citizens of more meager means were reduced to ever more desperate measures. Aside from their economic woes, the lower classes were also politically disenfranchised, as city politics were dominated by the archons and the Areopagus. The Athenian nobles, however, were themselves divided, as aristocratic families vied for ever more power and wealth, further contributing to the atmosphere of disorder and conflict. To remedy these maladies, Solon enacted a series of ambitious reforms. For one, he outlawed the practice of allowing citizens to be sold into slavery for the failure to pay a debt. Realizing that arable land was limited and faced with increasing population pressures, Solon encouraged citizens to engage in occupations other than farming, thus helping Athenian artisanship and trade to develop. He also outlawed the export of Athenian produce, save for the highly marketable Athenian olive oil, thus ensuring that the food produced on Attic soil would feed the Athenian people and reduce the hunger of the poorer citizens. As the first ever coins to be used as currency had just recently been minted across the Aegean Sea in Lydia, Solon developed a standardized system of weights and measures, and encouraged the usage of metal currency as opposed to the barter system by which most Athenians had hitherto lived. This served to increase commerce, and Athens for the first time began exporting goods, mostly olive oil and pottery, which would serve to form the basis of her future prosperity. Solon revised the laws which had been laid down by the earlier lawgiver Draco, making them less harsh. Additionally, Solon gave every citizen the right to appeal to a jury on which any citizen could serve, thus taking power away from the archons who had hitherto interpreted the laws. Solon also allowed for all citizens, regardless of wealth or standing, to be admitted into the ecclesia, the assembly, which served a largely legislative function. Thus, Solon established the foundations of a system in which all citizens could propound their own laws, and in which they could also be held accountable for their actions by their fellow citizens. Much of Solon's reputation lay in the fact that he was able to push the boundaries of the Athenian social order without ever pushing too far. This did not please his contemporaries, however. The Athenian aristocrats had hoped for only marginal reforms and were incensed by the economic and political gains made by the lower classes. The poorest citizens, on the other hand, had hoped that Solon would enforce a policy of land redistribution, even if that necessitated that he seize the reins of power and make himself tyrant. According to Herodotus, the Athenians had pledged to maintain his laws for 10 years, and so to prevent the citizenry from admonishing him to alter any of his laws, Solon left the country for a decade. Herodotus says that it was during this time that Solon visited the great Lydian king Croesus. After displaying his famous wealth to the lawgiver, Croesus asked Solon who he believed the happiest man was, fully expecting that Solon would say that it was he. Refusing to flatter and in strict accordance with his view of the truth, Solon answered that the happiest man was an Athenian named Tellus. Since his city was prosperous, he had fine sons and lived to see children born to each of them. He had wealth enough by Athenian standards, and he died a glorious death in battle, after which he was paid the high honor of a public funeral. Solon reasoned that as fate is fickle and ever-changing, until a man dies, no matter how fortunate he is not happy, but only lucky. The wisdom of these words was lost on King Croesus, however, who would only come to understand them at his own bitter end. But that is another story. Although the long-term ramifications of Solon's legacy were great, in the short term his reforms failed to harmonize Greek society. Upon his return to Athens, Solon found the Athenian population divided into factions. Solon greatly feared that the leader of one of these factions, the noble Pisistratus, would endeavor to make himself tyrant over the city. His fears were well founded, as before long Pisistratus did successfully assert his rule over Athens. Thus, Solon would die knowing that his beloved city was held by the tyrant whom he had opposed, and that his reforms had failed. However, in the long term, Solon's reforms were foundational to later Athenian law and government.